What's up, everybody? Chris Pennell here. We're going to my quarterback tier rankings for week 10 of the fantasy football season. If you do enjoy, make sure you like down below, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and let's dive right into it. And let me start this off by saying there is 4 teams on bye this week, and they're going to make a major impact on fantasy football this week. So the rankings are going to look a little bit wonky across the board, but we're without the Kansas City Chiefs, the Miami Dolphins, Philadelphia Eagles, or the Los Angeles Rams. And while they don't really have a quarterback we care too much about, you're still losing Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, no Jalen Hurts, no Patrick Mahomes, no Tua, Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, the list goes on. So we are going to be without some heavy hitters this weekend. So we are all feeling the pain, so don't worry, you were not alone. But let's get into the S tier here. We have 2 quarterbacks that make the list. Number 1 for me is going to be Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. He's a weekly member up in this range. You drafted him top 3 for a reason. He offers you rushing upside. He offers you passing upside. He's got great weapons to get the ball to. And Stephon Diggs, Gabe Davis, and Dalton Kincaid. And this is a team that likes to throw the football nearly 35 times per game, over a 70% completion percentage on the season, 270 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and a very good matchup at home versus the Denver Broncos. This game is also in prime time as well. 27.25 implied team total. They come in at 7.5 point favorites. 47 point over under, which is one of the highest of the entire week, and nearly 0.7 rushing touchdowns per game. Now, the rushing upside overall has been a bit down for Josh Allen this season, less than 2 designed runs per game. That's not counting scrambles, but I don't love that he's only at 2 designed runs and 25 rushing yards. But the Broncos are currently 25th versus quarterbacks, allowing 2 passing touchdowns per game and 270 passing yards. So basically right on the averages for Josh Allen. So I expect a really solid game from him. And then the guy he just faced on Sunday Night Football, Joe Burrow. He comes in at the S tier as well, gets a good spot versus Houston. And they just gave up a pretty big game to Baker Mayfield and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 26.5 point implied team total for the Cincinnati Bengals here at home. And Joe Burrow, while his overall numbers on the season are not looking up to par, he has been playing much better recently the past month now. So the previous 4 games for Joe Burrow, 27 points, 14 versus Seattle wasn't great, then the bye week, but then 27 versus San Francisco and 25 versus Buffalo. This is the Joe Burrow that we all know and love. And when he's at his peak, he is one of the absolute best quarterbacks, not only in the NFL, but for fantasy purposes as well. Does not really give you too much rushing upside, but that's fine because he's a guy that can go out there, get you 300 plus yards and multiple passing touchdowns. And like Josh Allen, no shortage of weapons here, and probably even better weapons in Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. So fire him up with confidence and a pretty good spot versus Houston, who's currently bottom half of the league versus fantasy quarterbacks. Now with our A tier, we're going to kick off with Detroit Lions quarterback Jared Goff, and he's had a pretty good year so far. Now the past 2 weeks for him have not been super impressive, but on the season, 270 passing yards, 1.5 passing touchdowns, throwing the ball nearly 34 times per game, close to a 70% completion percentage. But I am mainly interested in this matchup versus the Los Angeles Chargers, who are currently allowing the 3rd most points per game in the quarterback position, over 300 passing yards, 22.6 fantasy points per game to the position. And the Lions come in with one of the higher implied team totals of the week at 25 points, 1.5 point favorites on the road in the Dome in Los Angeles. And this game does feature the highest over-under of the week, so I like both quarterbacks a lot. And speaking of both quarterbacks, Justin Herbert comes up next. This is a bit of a coin flip for me. I could see this going either way, but Goff does draw the better matchup, giving him an edge there. Justin Herbert does have some pretty similar numbers on the season. 250 passing yards, so not quite as much as Jared Goff, but 1.6 passing touchdowns, 67% completion percentage, and throwing the ball nearly 33 times per game. The Lions just edged them out in the implied team total. So again, Goff's slight edge there, but both quarterbacks are firmly in play. Justin Fields looks like he's going to return this week, and he draws a great matchup versus the Carolina Panthers. And while I'm not the biggest fan of Justin Fields, in the right matchup, he can be 100% playable. And we've seen that so far this year. So prior to getting injured versus Minnesota, in week 4 and week 5, we're talking 32 fantasy points and 33 fantasy points. And that was pretty much all through the air. And the reason we play Justin Fields is because of what he can do on the ground. But the majority of that was from what he did with his arm. 335 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, and then 282 yards and 4 passing touchdowns in great matchups versus the Denver Broncos and the Washington Commanders, 2 of the worst defenses in football. Now, the Carolina Panthers, they are one of the worst run defenses in the NFL, which bodes really well for Justin Fields. This game is on Thursday night, which I'm never the biggest fan of Thursday night football games. A 21.5 point implied team total here. It's going to be enough for this week to make him in the A tier. And rounding out our A tier here, we have Lamar Jackson, despite the awful matchup versus the Cleveland Browns. They scored nearly 29 fantasy points versus them earlier in the season. And while I don't expect fireworks from Lamar Jackson, with what he can do on the ground every single week gives him such a safe floor that not most quarterbacks have. Really, only Jalen Hurts can match him with that, and maybe even Kyler Murray with him returning this week, although we will see. But just because of the rushing upside, Lamar Jackson makes it, despite the Cleveland Browns offering the 2nd fewest points per game to the quarterback position at 13.7, 167 passing yards, and not much in the rushing game, but I mean, they don't really face Lamar Jackson every single week, so that's a bit of a noisy stat. And leading off our B tier, we have Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys, and I loved him last week, and another solid performance from the Dallas Cowboys quarterback. And this is another good matchup here versus the New York Giants. So the previous 3 weeks for Dak Prescott, we've had a pretty rough season before then in week 6, but 25 points versus the Chargers, 32 points versus the Rams, and then 31 points versus the Philadelphia Eagles. And then in the upcoming weeks, we have the Giants, Panthers, Commanders, and the Seattle Seahawks, and then Philly again. So the good matchups keep rolling for Dak Prescott, and I like him here versus the New York Giants. We know their defense and really just team in general is not something to be concerned about. On the season, they are allowing the 8th fewest points per game to the quarterback position, but I think this Dallas offense can definitely have success versus the Giants defense. And the Cowboys do own one of the highest implied team totals of the week at 27.5, which I actually believe is the highest, just edging out the Buffalo Bills. Now, the only problem here is that this game features a 38.5 point over-under. So they are 16.5 point favorites. So the concern would be is that the Cowboys get to a big enough lead that just Dak Prescott on the passing side of this offense doesn't have to do anything in the second half. But with so much parity in the NFL, you can really never account for a blowout, but just know that's a concern. Trevor Lawrence comes in next for me. A decent spot versus the 49ers. Now, on the season, they're only allowing the 10th fewest points per game in the quarterback position. But we've seen quarterbacks so far this year have success versus him. I'm not saying T-Law's had the greatest year in the world, but he's averaging nearly 3 fantasy points on the ground per game this season. About 250 passing yards, throwing the ball 32 times per game. He's got Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, Travis Etienne out there to do some damage. So with the way this quarterback slate lays out for us this weekend, Lawrence is definitely going to be playable. And then we also have Kyler Murray making his return after a long absence. And just because of his rushing upside, that's going to put him in play just nearly every single week. This matchup versus Atlanta, they're currently 21st versus the quarterback position. So if you're going to give me some rushing upside out of quarterback, which we've seen out of Kyler Murray in the past, I will take it. Now, the weapons, they're a bit short over in Arizona right now, still dealing with James Conner's injury, but we have Marquise Brown. I know Michael Wilson missed last week. Zach Ertz is on the IR, but Trey McBride's definitely a serviceable fill and probably better than Zach Ertz at this point, but it's really just because he's a rushing quarterback and that is going to keep him in play. Leading off our C tier is going to be CJ Stroud of the Houston Texans. You're probably wondering why he's not in the B tier. I know, explosion game last week. I liked him too, but that does not mean he's going to put up 40 fantasy points every single week. Bit of a tougher spot versus Cincinnati Bengals on the road here. 6.5 point dogs, 20 point implied team total. They are 19th versus quarterback, so it's a pretty average matchup for the most part, allowing 250 passing yards and 1 passing touchdown per game. But on the season, 280 passing yards for CJ Stroud, 1.75 passing touchdowns, not turning the ball over too much, 8.1 yards per attempt. The completion percentage is pretty low, but it has been rising in recent weeks. And he's got good weapons. He has Tank Dell, monster game on Sunday, Nico Collins, and then we also have Noah Brown, who had a monster game as well. I think he put in roughly right around 25 fantasy points. So while I might be a little bit low on Stroud here, I don't think he's going to repeat the performance we saw on Sunday, but he still is a very serviceable low-end QB1, I would say, especially on a week like this. Then we have Sam Howell, also in the C tier. He's been pretty solid so far this season. 275 passing yards per game, 1.5 passing touchdowns. Doesn't really offer too much rushing upside, but nearly 20 yards per game. Also throwing the ball a ton, nearly 36 times per game, which is most of all the quarterbacks that we are talking about. And the matchup versus Seattle, I don't think they're the worst defense in the world, but versus quarterbacks, they're pretty much league average to a little bit below average. 250 passing yards per game. We have good weapons to get the ball to, while they're not big household names. Terry McLaurin, Curtis Samuel, if he happens to play, Jahan Dotson, Logan Thomas. So he's fine. He's been getting the job done. I don't really think too much is going to change here versus Seattle. Brock Purdy, after the 49ers bye week, he's going to be coming play once again. Just such a good offense. Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk. He's got all the weapons you can ask for. Christian McCaffrey out of the backfield. And this Jacksonville Jaguars defense has been pretty kind to quarterbacks this year. 28th versus position, meaning they're allowing the 5th most points per game. And on the season, Brock Purdy's numbers, while they're not overly ecstatic, he's at 9.1 yards per attempt, which is great. Nearly a 70% completion percentage, 250 passing yards per game, and 1.5 passing touchdowns. The problem is he has to be efficient because they do not throw the ball a lot whatsoever, only 25 times per game. But with this matchup and a 24-point implied team total, 49ers and Brock Purdy definitely become in play. Now, they're on the road. I would prefer them at home, but I'm not going to be too concerned about that. Then Geno Smith is going to round out our C tier. He gets a great matchup versus the Washington Commanders, one of the absolute worst defenses in the NFL right now, one of the highest implied team totals of the week, as well playing at home in Seattle with a nearly 26-point implied team total, 6-point favorites at home, and a 45.5 point over-under. Now, Geno has not been good this year. Do not get it twisted. 225 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, throwing the ball only 28 times per game, 65% completion percentage, and only 6 rushing yards per game. But they're allowing the 3rd most points per game to the position. They allowed Mac Jones to get like 12 points last week. I think Geno Smith has upside for 15 plus points. And with how bad this week is at the quarterback position, that might be able to get the job done for you. Then we have our D tier, and hopefully you don't have to start a quarterback from this area, but if you're dealing with a bye week, I guess I understand it if you have to hit the waiver wire. But number 1 for me is going to be Baker Mayfield of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's got 2 great weapons and Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. Also, K. Dotton caught a couple of touchdowns last week versus the Houston Texans. We have a 20-point implied team total versus Tennessee. They are a little bit easier to pass on than they are versus the run, but they're still allowing only the 12th fewest points per game in the quarterback position. You're looking for a guy that's averaging about 240 and 1.5 touchdowns per game. Baker Mayfield is your guy. It's not going to be pretty, but he can always kind of walk into 250 and 2, which is more than enough, I think, if you're just looking for a streamer this week. Deshaun Watson looked pretty good versus Arizona. I realized one of his touchdowns was a tip ball. Not to say that couldn't have gone right to Amari Cooper anyway in the end zone, but just made it a little bit more difficult. But he had some absolute dimes of throws in that game. A long ball to Amari Cooper, then another long ball in double coverage to Amari Cooper. Him and Amari were just on a different level in that game. But I am concerned on the road in Baltimore. This is one of the lowest implied team totals of the weekend, 16.25 for the Cleveland Browns, 6-point dogs on the road in Baltimore, allowing the fewest points per game to the position, only 200 passing yards and 0.6 passing touchdowns. He does offer you a little bit of rushing upside, which gives him a decent floor, but this is definitely not a great spot. Then we also have Derek Carr of the New Orleans Saints, and gets a decent matchup versus the Vikings. They're pretty much middle of the road versus the pass, but we've seen their pass defense struggle the past few seasons. Nearly a 22-point implied team total. We're in a dome, so don't have to worry about any weather. He's averaging 240 and 1 on the season, which isn't great, but he's got good weapons. And Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, Alvin Kamara in the backfield. There's really not much else to say here, but he is serviceable, and we have seen him string together a couple of 20-point games. And now the F tier. This is where things get really ugly, and if you were desperate, well, I'm sorry. It's probably not going to work out too great this week. But we do have Taylor Heineke versus Arizona Cardinals. He put together 15 points last week, which honestly not too bad. Threw the ball 38 times in that one, but the Cardinals are currently 24th versus quarterbacks. Gave Deshaun Watson a pretty good game with how bad he's played this year. That's pretty encouraging. So Heineke's fine. Just don't expect too much. Josh Dobbs just came off the streets to Minnesota. Not like he wasn't starting in Arizona, but his first game there, he just got thrusted into action with Jaren Hall leaving. And while Josh Dobbs is not the most exciting thing out there, he does offer you a little bit of rushing upside. Had a nice rushing touchdown as a Viking in his first game. Matchup versus New Orleans, they are allowing the 10th fewest points per game to the quarterback position, but he is averaging 36 yards on the ground, which is good enough for me in the F tier. Then we have Russell Wilson of the Denver Broncos playing the Buffalo Bills in prime time. Nearly a 20-point implied team total, which is nice. Higher over-under in this game at 47. 7.5-point dogs, so they should be throwing the ball quite a bit. And while this is not that sustainable when you're only throwing the ball 25 times per game, he is averaging 2 passing touchdowns on the season per game. And while the matchup isn't great versus Buffalo, as they're allowing the 6th fewest points per game to the position, we're not asking for too much down here. Then to finish off our top 20, we have Bryce Young of the Carolina Panthers. The rookie has obviously not had a great rookie season so far. Less than 200 passing yards per game, barely over 1 passing touchdown. Throwing the ball 31 times per game and only 5.4 yards per attempt, which is the worst of any guy we have talked about so far. 18-point implied team total on the road in Chicago. But this is a great matchup. The Bears are allowing 2.2 passing touchdowns per game, nearly 270 passing yards, and they're allowing the 4th most points per game in the quarterback position at 22.3. So if there's ever a time to play Bryce Young, this is one of those times, and it's only if it's desperate measures. But with that being said, that's all I got for today's video, so I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure you leave a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. If you have any questions about start-sit decisions, trade options, whatever it may be, leave them down below. I'm more than happy to answer them. I wish you all the best of luck, and I'll see you all next time.